Welcome to From World War to Cold War, Part 2, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. In August 1949, the Cold War entered a new and more dangerous phase. The Soviet Union successfully detonated an atomic bomb similar in destructive power to the ones America had developed in 1945. Once the news was confirmed, President Truman had to announce the American people that Stalin, too, had the bomb. The U.S. government was caught off guard by this development. They had believed it would be many more years before the Soviets would possess nuclear weapons technology. A year later, in 1950, it was discovered that Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked on the original Manhattan Project, had been a spy for the Soviets, passing them top-secret information they used to build their own bombs. Fuchs confessed and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Americans had felt more confident about the Cold War when they had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. In response, Harry Truman approved the development of an even more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. Its thermonuclear explosion would prove as deadly as 500 of the atom bombs that had been used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. would not perfect the H-bomb until 1954, but this time the Soviets would be close behind. They would successfully test one of their own the following year in 1955. During the Cold War, there was never an officially declared conflict with the USSR, but the nation readied itself for war in unprecedented ways. In 1947, Congress had restructured the nation's military and intelligence agencies by passing the National Security Act. It merged the War Department and the Navy Department into a single Department of Defense. It also established the U.S. Air Force as a military service officially separate from the Army. The act created the National Security Council, a small body of advisors, cabinet members, and military chiefs to advise the president on foreign policy. And it created the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, the nation's first peacetime spy agency charged with gathering overseas intelligence. In 1948, with only about 500,000 men remaining in the Army, President Truman issued a peacetime draft calling for as many as 10 million men to register for military service. By 1950, defense spending would account for 1/3 of the federal budget. There had been a time before World War II when Americans would have shunned the idea of entering into a permanent military alliance with other nations. In fact, Americans had historically been proud of their country's neutrality and isolationism. Now, with the threat to Berlin still fresh, the U.S. and its Western allies formed just such an alliance in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. The nations that joined NATO during the Cold War can be seen in blue on this map, although Canada and the U.S. were also members. NATO was specifically designed to counter a Soviet threat to Western Europe. If any NATO nation was attacked by the USSR, all NATO nations would come to its defense. This meant that any Soviet aggression beyond the Iron Curtain might trigger nuclear war with the United States, and in all likelihood, a Soviet nuclear counterattack. The whole point of NATO was to present to the Soviet Union so great a threat that it would never dare attack the West, the ultimate containment strategy. NATO provided the West with collective security, but it marked a turning point for the United States. For the first time ever in its history, America had pledged itself to go to war if any of its allies were attacked. In the new post-war reality, the United States had not only assumed the role of the world's leading nation, but it had also committed itself to being the free world's shield. After World War II, many parts of the world that had once been colonies or imperial possessions of other nations won their own independence. These new nations of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, sometimes called the Third World, began the process of choosing their forms of government and their economic systems. Would they align themselves more with the U.S. or the USSR? The Truman administration provided financial aid to many of these developing nations to keep them attached to the West and to steer them away from adopting communism. China was certainly not a new nation, but it was a poor nation, and it had long been dominated by the West in a way many Chinese people found insulting. Civil war had raged in China since 1927. A communist faction led by Mao Zedong fought against the official nationalist government of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Despite its internal conflict, the Chinese had fought in World War II on the side of the Allies, mostly against the Japanese. As many as 20 million Chinese died as a result of the war. During the early Cold War, the United States gave the Chinese nationalists almost $3 billion in support, but President Truman was reluctant to more fully support Chiang Kai-shek, who was unpopular and seen as incompetent by most Chinese. In October 1949, Mao's communists won the Civil War and declared their country the People's Republic of China. The nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan to form a rival Chinese government. The news that China, and with it 1/4 of the Earth's population, had fallen to communism was devastating news to Americans. Even though Mao's communists had achieved victory largely without the help of the Soviet Union, Red China was viewed as a great victory for the Soviets and a disaster for the West. In the U.S., some of Truman's Republican opponents accused him of losing China and not doing more to prevent it. His harshest critics even claimed that Truman's State Department was full of pro-communists who had allowed it to happen. The president believed that the U.S. could not have changed China's path without a massive military commitment to support the unpopular government of Chiang Kai-shek, something he had found unwise. But going forward, Truman would remain sensitive to the charges that he was soft on communism. To provide a balance in Asia, the U.S. became newly committed to rebuilding the economy of Japan, which it had occupied since the end of World War II. By the 1950s, a democratic, economically thriving Japan existed as a counterbalance to communist China. In 1951, Japan and the U.S. signed an official peace treaty and a security pact, putting Japan firmly in America's orbit. Asia was now considered one of the chief battlegrounds in the global fight against communism. In 1950, the Cold War turned hot in Asia, in the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese had controlled Korea since 1910, but when the Allies won World War II in 1945, they were forced out. After the war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had divided the peninsula at the line called the 38th parallel. Not unlike the situation in Germany, the plan had been to reunite North Korea and South Korea as one nation, but once the Cold War began, Americans and Soviets could not agree on unification. The USSR supported the Korean Communist Party in the north, while the U.S. supported the Korean Democratic Party in the south. By 1948, the two Koreas were officially established as separate nations, and America withdrew most of its troops. The Soviets did the same. Few considered Korea a vital part of the world for American interests. But in June 1950, North Korea sent more than 75,000 soldiers across the 38th parallel to invade the South. North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, intended to unify Korea as one communist nation. President Truman, still sensitive to the charges that he had lost China, decided to send American forces, including ground troops, to intervene. He called Korea the Greece of the Far East.
After the United Nations declared North Korea's invasion illegal, the U.S. requested and obtained authorization to assemble a UN force to defend South Korea. It would be the first major test of the UN's ability to keep the international peace. Harry Truman named General Douglas MacArthur, hero of the Pacific theater of World War II, to command the mission. Truman never asked Congress for an official declaration of war, which made the Korean conflict technically a police action instead of an actual war. 16 UN member nations, many of them NATO allies, sent troops, but in the end, the Korean War was mostly America's conflict. About 88% of the eventual fighting force of 1.8 million soldiers were Americans, and U.S. generals determined the military strategy.
A proxy is someone who acts on behalf of another. Because of this, the Korean War was called a proxy war, one of several Cold War conflicts in which the Soviets and the West faced off indirectly through limited wars in other parts of the world. North Korean forces enjoyed early successes, taking the South's capital city, Seoul, and driving deep into the peninsula. By September 1950, South Korean and UN troops had to retreat all the way to Pusan. But General Douglas MacArthur then made a bold move, landing soldiers in Incheon behind North Korea's front lines. The North's forces retreated and were soon pushed back beyond the 38th parallel. By November, the United Nations mission to defend South Korea had been accomplished. But should it go further? Many in the U.S. government, as well as more than 60% of the American public, favored expanding the war into North Korea, changing the UN's military objective from containment to the reunification of Korea without communism. The UN approved this, and President Truman went along to a point. He ordered Douglas MacArthur to go beyond the 38th parallel in order to destroy North Korean communist forces, but he also ordered MacArthur to stay away from the shared border between North Korea and China. The president wanted to avoid a larger Asian conflict and did not want the Chinese to enter the war. But MacArthur disobeyed this order, sending troops so close to China that 150,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the border to support North Korea and pushed the UN forces back into the south. Americans were now fighting communists from China as well as North Korea. By the spring of 1951, the U.S.-led coalition succeeded in once again pushing the enemy back to the 38th parallel. At this point, Truman changed his mind and forbid MacArthur to pursue the communists into the north. He wanted to seek a settlement to end the war with Korea still divided. He wasn't alone. 66% of Americans polled now wanted to pull troops out of Korea. MacArthur was furious. He wanted to expand the war into China itself, attacking targets there. MacArthur was an aggressive general, and to him, simply containing the enemy was a pointless exercise that equaled a victory for communism. Shockingly, the popular general took his case public, speaking out against Truman and appealing directly to the American people for support. In April 1951, Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur for insubordination, or defiance of authority, but this proved an unpopular move that lost him support with much of the public. The president's popularity never recovered, and he was unable to end the war. Ceasefire negotiations began in July 1951, but would drag on for 2 more years. By that time, 12,000 more American soldiers would be dead, and Harry Truman would no longer be president. In 1952, as the Korean War dragged on into a 3rd year, the Republican Party capitalized on its unpopularity by nominating General Dwight D. Eisenhower for president. Eisenhower had been the Allied supreme commander in Europe, responsible for D-Day and the defeat of Germany. In 1950, Harry Truman had appointed him to the first supreme commander of NATO. In the election, Republicans harped on the Democrats' inability to win the war in Korea. Eisenhower's opponent for president, Illinois Democratic Governor Adlai Stevenson, proved no match for the war hero. Eisenhower won in a landslide. Just 6 months after the new president took office, in July 1953, North and South Korea reached an armistice, a ceasefire that left the peninsula divided almost exactly as it had been before the war started 3 years earlier. Korea was no longer divided by the 38th parallel, but by a ceasefire line that remains, more than 60 years later, a demilitarized zone between the two nations. The two Koreas have never reunified, and in fact, the armistice agreed upon in 1953 still remains in effect today. Officially, the Korean War has never truly ended. More than 36,000 Americans died in the conflict. Another 100,000 were wounded. When North Korea, South Korea, and Chinese casualties are included, well over 1 million people died. Was Korea a Cold War success for the United States? Harry Truman thought so, even if it was his successor Dwight Eisenhower who actually concluded the war. Truman believed that the UN's successful defense of South Korea was a victory for containment. Under his leadership, the U.S. had followed the Truman Doctrine and delivered on its promise to help a democratic nation resist a communist takeover. Furthermore, despite some threats that they might be used, the war had been fought without using nuclear weapons, and despite the eventual involvement of 20 nations, it had not turned into a Third World War. The Korean War would be the first, but not the last time Americans fought and died overseas to contain communism. But interestingly, it would mark the only time in the Cold War that the U.S. went beyond containment and tried to roll back communism by military force, when Truman briefly ordered Douglas MacArthur to lead an aggressive campaign into North Korea. Truman and the presidents who followed him would follow a stricter policy of containment going forward. But many Americans agreed with Douglas MacArthur that America had gained little for its efforts. Truman had succeeded all too well in scaring the hell out of the country at the start of the Cold War. If the communist enemy was really so evil, and if resisting its spread was truly so important, then why not destroy it once and for all at any cost? Why not invade Red China and rid it of communism, as MacArthur had practically begged Truman to do? Why had 36,000 Americans died simply to preserve a status quo? In the years to come, presidents including Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and Richard Nixon, each and every one a dedicated Cold Warrior, would face accusations that they were soft on communism because they refused to confront the Soviet Union head-on. The containment policy initiated by Truman would face many challenges in the decades to come. The Korean War was over, but the Cold War was just beginning. It would last until 1991, when the USSR officially ceased to exist. Korea brought about a buildup in American military power and spending that never truly went away. The size of the armed forces tripled. In 1950, before Korea, the U.S. military budget had been about $14 billion. By 1953, it was $50 billion, and defense spending made up 60% of the federal budget. Even after the Korean War ended, military spending would remain permanently above $40 billion, which was unprecedented at a time when America was technically at peace. Gone was the era in U.S. history when the nation would significantly reduce the size and cost of its military between wars. Instead, America would be on a permanent war footing. Harry Truman began his term in office as an accidental president, but his would be a presidency of great consequence. Truman's insistence on opposing communism around the world would define American leadership for the future. The presidents who followed him, starting with Dwight D. Eisenhower, were now committed to controlling military and political events far beyond America's borders, with no end in sight. In 1953, the year the Korean War ended, Joseph Stalin died of natural causes. But his death did not bring about the thawing of the Cold War that George Kennan had once predicted. In the decades to come, the U.S. would continue to battle communism in Germany, in Vietnam, in Cuba, even in space.